Hi everyone, it's Lauren and these are the reviews for the books that I read in the second half of January. If you'd like to see what I read in the first half of January, I will link my January wrap-up part 1 in the corner up there. The first book that I have as part of this wrap-up is a poetry collection, and that is Unbalanced by Sinead Morrissey. The poems in this collection focus on kind of engineering, but those are both natural features of engineering, so like landscapes, and also human feats of engineering. This whole collection didn't wow me really. I felt quite underwhelmed by it. I did read it because it was shortlisted for the Costa Poetry Award, and similarly I read Inside the Wave by Helen Dunmore, which was shortlisted, which it won the poetry category for Costa and the Costa Book of the Year award, and I was quite underwhelmed by that as well. And coming away from both of these two collections in quite a short space of time, I just feel like poetry is something where I don't feel comfortable with it as a reader. I don't feel like I know what I'm doing when I'm reading poems, and I seem to give up on poems quite quickly. So if there's something I don't like, I very quickly go, oh, I don't like this, and I don't sort of tend to give it a chance. Some of the things that happen in this book, she's not just playing with words, she's also playing with form on the page, which some people might like. I find quite annoying when poems are written sort of like this, or like this, for example. This poem really annoyed me. I was just like, why? There is no reason for it to be done like that. When I read poems in that form, a part of me, and not a small part of me, jumps back and feels like it's very pretentious very quickly, and I just think, oh no, well I don't like you then. So I think for me, I need poetry to be very much about the language, and it needs to be quite visceral and evocative. Those are the poems that I've found in the small amount of collections that I've read that I really identify with. So for me, this wasn't for me, but I do come away from it feeling like I just haven't got it, and I haven't got something. So I'm not sure whether I'm going to continue reading different poetry collections, or if I should just go, do you know what, it's not a genre for me. I'll see how I feel. I'd love to hear from you if you've got any recommendations, if you're into poetry or not, if you liked this collection. I kind of feel out of my depth with it, so I would like a bit of direction, I think. Next, I read Cranford by Elizabeth Gaskell, and I read this because Lucy Powery on her channel said that North and South, I think, was one of her favourite books of last year. And I've not read any Elizabeth Gaskell. I've heard so many good things about her. I've had Cranford and North and South, I think, downloaded on my Kindle for ages, so I thought I'd start with the shorter one and see how I like her writing. And this book was just pure delight for me, really. I think there's something about this kind of cosy 19th century writing which is very comforting and just nice, and you can just kind of slip into the characters and it's all fun and games, and I just really liked it. This book is about a village called Cranford, and it's about the inhabitants of that village. We get most of the narration from an outsider called Mary, who kind of learns about what's happening in Cranford through letters or through her various visits, and it's really about an older lady in the village, Miss Matty, and her past and her family. But really it's about all of the ladies in Cranford and just about their various goings on. I felt like the characters were really well observed, and I say that as someone who's not from the 19th century, so I don't really know what people would have been like, I suppose, but it's that kind of domestic humour where people are just very slightly eccentric, and so therefore they are quite funny, and I really enjoyed it, so I'm definitely going to be picking up North and South later this year as well. Next, I read The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho, and this was a pick for my book club, and I don't know with this book, I don't really know what to say. It's very, very short. This is about a young shepherd in Spain who kind of meets this magical king person who tells him, you've got to follow your dream and go to Egypt and find some treasure. And so he goes on this quest to fulfill his personal destiny. And throughout that, he meets various characters who have lots of moral things to tell him about the world. It's not a very long book at all. It did feel like an extended Aesop's fable. It felt like a fable crossed with a parable, crossed with a fairy tale. It's one of those kind of adventure stories where nobody really has a name and they just continue and they learn lots of things about themselves and the world along the way. I personally felt like this book was like laughing at me. But by the end of the book, I just kind of thought, what was the point of this? The last line of the book might as well have been, maybe the real alchemist was the friends we made along the way. Like, I just felt like, why am I reading this? Although, I will say, at the beginning of the book, while I was reading it, it was all about kind of fulfilling your dreams and doing stuff and leaving your day-to-day life behind and seeing the world. And at first, while I was reading it, I was thinking, oh wow, this is pretty inspiring. But you know, it did feel like a book full of platitudes and full of ideas, but nothing really concrete enough. So, and I finished off the month reading The Book of Dust by Philip Pullman, the first part of the Book of Dust trilogy. I think it's going to be La Belle Sauvage. I have mixed feelings about this book. I absolutely love the His Dark Materials trilogy. They were such a staple of my childhood. I reread them a couple of years ago and still really loved them. This book is a prequel to The Northern Lights, and Lyra, the main character from that trilogy, is a baby in this book. So we follow a young boy who works in a pub called Malcolm and his friend Alice as they get involved in all of the various dark and friendly forces at work in Oxford. Some people are trying to protect Lyra, some people are trying to take her away, and there's also this big flood which happens, and they go on a bit of an adventure. My experience with this book was quite odd. I started reading it way before Christmas, but I was just reading it as and when, and a little bit at night time, because it did feel like sort of curling up with an old friend and getting back into that world, which I really, really enjoyed. So I wanted to take my time with it. I do kind of now think that reading it that way probably wasn't the best way to read it, because the whole first half of the book really felt like it was scene setting. There were lots of different characters that came into the book, and as is quite reminiscent of the Northern Lights trilogy, a lot of these characters are very scientific or political, and for me, I kept forgetting who people were. There's all these kind of adults in the world who kept being introduced, and I couldn't remember kind of what their role was within the society. But that could well have been because I wasn't reading it kind of in one go. And then the second half of the book, or the third of the book really, it kind of felt like a lot of scene setting was happening, and then we got into the kind of real adventure side of the story. And that bit I just absolutely whizzed through, and I got so sucked in, and I read kind of half a book over the course of a day or two, I think. So I feel like, to me, the pacing in this book feels off, but that could be because of the way I read it. I find it difficult to be objective about this book because I loved His Dark Materials so much. I felt like as I was reading it, partly I was loving it because we're back in that universe, and then part of me was also thinking, oh, I don't know if I love it as much as The Northern Lights, but then that's something that I read when I was a child, so it's very difficult to kind of compare the reading experiences in that way. I will say that although this is a prequel, and I feel like Philip Pullman has said you can kind of, I don't think he said you have to read His Dark Materials before reading this, but I would really recommend that you do, because I feel like that eases you into this universe a lot better than this book does. I also found it very dark in places, and there were some fantastical elements in here which I felt like came a little bit out of the blue, and I think without the context of His Dark Materials, this would feel a little bit weird, I imagine, for kind of a novice reader to the universe. I'll also reserve my judgment until the other books in this series come out, because to be fair, with something like The Northern Lights, although it's the beginning of a trilogy, it can kind of be read standalone to a certain extent, whereas this book didn't feel like it was meant to be standalone at all. This feels like the beginning of a very long extended book, and I've just stopped at a certain point. So as always, I would love to hear from you. If you've read any of these books, I'd love to hear your opinions on them. What else have you been reading in January? How glad are you that January is over? I was so happy this morning on the 1st of February. It was sunny outside, and I was just like, yes, we're out of it. It's nearly time for Christmas now. So I hope you are well, and I will see you in my next video. Bye.